So good morning, everyone. The Victoria Arts Council respectfully acknowledges the Lekwungen-speaking people within whose traditional territory we operate, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and WSÁNEĆ First Nations, whose historical relationships with this land and diverse cultural heritage continues to this day. We raise our hands in gratitude for the ancestors, the matriarchs, hereditary leaders, and the artists, especially from these lands. We give thanks for the privilege and working here, for living and working here. My name is Kagan McFadden, and I am the Executive Director of the Victoria Arts Council, as well as the co-lead for CreativeMornings Victoria. And it's my privilege and honor to welcome you all here today. And I'm going to pass it over to our program coordinator, Cass McConkey.
Thank you. I'm going to share some slides. All right, welcome to Creative Mornings. September's theme is depth. Depth is a space that denies easy ways of seeing or comprehending. When we shine a light into the deep blue of the ocean, we cannot see much farther than the surface. In our age of instant answers, we bristle at this resistance. It's often easier to reduce people, places, and ideas into flattened renderings rather than grapple with the nuanced and contradictory truths found in their depths. Our Columbus chapter chose this month's exploration of depth, and Brian Christopher Moss illustrated the theme. Thank you to MailChimp, Creative Mornings' official global partner for marketing. MailChimp & Co. wants to help you learn in good company. Did you know they have a page full of resources for freelancers and agencies? You can find in-depth guides, stories, and insights, all designed to help support your growing business. Browse these and many more at MailChimp & Co.'s resource library. Thank you to the City of Victoria and the CRD for their continued support. And thank you to HCMA. HCMA is an architecture firm that designs buildings, brands, and shared experiences that connect people. We are from the Victoria Arts Council, and we'd like to share our current exhibition, Gifts from the Ancestors, the debut solo show by Josh, our speaker today. Gifts from the Ancestors is informed by Nuu-Chah-Nulth histories, legends, and traditional carving techniques. Josh has transformed our VAC main gallery to look like a longhouse as a way of honoring his cultural teachings while commenting on current societal topics. In the window of our gallery, there is a poem, Welcome Song by Linnea Jericho. Today, the second annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, you are invited to join guest curator Monique Gray-Smith as she visits with CBC host of the next chapter, Shayla Rogers. Together, they will explore the importance of the truth and how it can be an inspiration in our path forward. Tickets are available at the Victoria Festival of Authors website, and it is happening later today at 7:30. Without further ado, please welcome our speaker today. Hatwich Wayanis Joshua Watts is a Nuu-Chah-Nulth and Coast Salish First Nations professional artist and cultural carrier. He was raised in Squamish away from his ancestral territories of Port Alberni and Lake Cowichan. When he was growing up, he had little connection with his ancestral culture. After reconnecting, he realized the importance of culture and art. Since then, Joshua has dedicated his practice towards youth development and mentorship programs and is a very strong advocate for cultural revitalization among Indigenous youth and passing on traditional knowledge. Watts has studied under great artists such as Ray Natuoro, Wayne Alfred, Corey Bulpett, Linda Lindsay, and the late Chief and Master Carver Bodek. I will now pass it over to Josh.
Hello, thanks for being here, and thank you everyone for making this happen. I'm grateful to be able to share some words and spend some time with everybody signing on and checking out this talk. For the topic of depth, I just wanted to cover sort of like 4 main points, but at the end, at the Q&A, I'm welcome to any questions or any kind of comments that anybody wants to share. I just wanted to expand on the introduction. Thank you for that introduction of where I'm from, and I just wanted to share a bit more about my family and my name. My name's Hatwich, and that's from the Sishot Nation. And the Sishot Nation is a part of a larger group called the Nuu-Chah-Nulth Nation, which we all reside on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And my other half, from my grandmother's side, is Subosset from Lake Cowichan. They're also part of the Nuu-Chah-Nulth Nation as the larger group. And I was also adopted to the Squamish Nation, a part of the Squamish people, as I grew up in Squamish. And I think to start off, what I wanted to say was to just kind of talk about how I started doing art and my whole, I guess, meaning of my practice. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is because I feel like depth, talking about arts practice and when it comes to Indigenous art and First Nations art, I feel like the context of depth means to recognize it's ceremonial art, not just like decorative art, which I find sometimes our art is seen as something that's a bit more meaningful in the beauty rather than, you know, the history and the context of our objects and our practice. So yeah, I'll just briefly, sorry, doing this on my phone. So I just wanted to mention that I started doing this because I grew up canoeing in Squamish, and I grew up traveling to different, mostly Coast Salish communities, to these seasonal canoe races, and I had a lot of fun. I did that for 5 years or so when I was a teenager, from I think 12 years old till I was almost 17. And that was a big part of finding out my identity and where I was from, because when I was younger, I didn't realize there were nations. I thought, you know, First Nations people, I thought as a kid that we were all a part of a large group, which I thought about in my adult life, thinking about kind of like the Pan-Indian, like where we're all a part of this like large generalized group of people. And that's one way to look at it, that we all are a part of a large group of Indigenous people. But us as individuals, we have such a unique culture and such a specific upbringing, and it all depends on the territory and the land we grew up on. So for me, canoeing is what brought me to our art and culture. That was my introduction. And for others, sometimes it's hunting, sometimes it's gathering medicine or weaving, or even just listening to the legends and the stories that our rich culture you know, share through the lifetimes. And so my first thing that I ever worked on was seagoing canoe under my teacher, Ray Natoro, who was a big part of my, I guess, embarking on my art journey. I worked with him for like 3 or 4 years. We carved 2 seagoing traditional canoes that were dug out from a cedar log, and we carved those. And in 2014, we traveled to Bella Bella from Squamish on what's called, I'm having a brain fart about what the name, it's basically, we all get together and we gather from all the nations along the coast, and we decide a host nation along the coast, and somebody will volunteer to invite everybody to their community, and everybody paddles there and forms kind of like a larger group as everybody goes along. And let's go tribal journeys. Sorry, I was blanking on the name for a second, but I was a part of the group and a part of the canoe family that traveled from the Squamish Nation to they call it Gatwas in Bella Bella, which was their 30 something year anniversary of the previous tribal journeys that they hosted. And so it was a huge event, and that was a big part of my inspiration to, you know, wanting to create art, was that whole journey. being just immersed in the culture and being able to see everybody's territory from a different perspective on the water. So that's how I started, but I'm doing not just canoes now. That was like a very special project to be a part of, but now I'm carving masks and other ceremonial objects and doing paintings and prints and even experimenting with more contemporary works. For those who've seen my show, that was a big part of my motivation for creating a collection of works, was trying new things like painting on dried salmon skin and learning how to make silkscreen prints and experimenting with mediums, printing on different mediums, and experimenting with the use of different materials rather than our traditional materials of cedar. And a lot of people know our art form for our two-dimensional design work, like the famous Bill Reed and Robert Davidson, where they're very intricate Northwest Coast designs on paper. So I don't know how long I'm rambling on for, but I also wanted to touch on today. So today we honor the residential school survivors and our ancestors that fought for us to be able to practice our culture and to learn our art form and share it with each other. But now we have the privilege also to, teach our future generations, which they weren't allowed to do. They were in prison for many years during the potlatch ban. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because without their sacrifice and without their resolve and overcoming the unjust laws that were placed on them during the time, I believe we live in a day now where it's encouraged and where it's a positive thing for our people to be able to share it with everybody. And so I'm just really proud to celebrate today, and I'm thankful for all of my elders and ancestors that fought so hard. My whole family is celebrating today in Port Alberni and Squamish, so everybody's a part of public events, and I'm happy to be here to share today with you, to be able to spread the word and just acknowledge that. Kind of expanding further on the ideas that I shared about our art form being a bit more than just for decoration or for the material object. Is just the start of our art form. And I find there's a lot of focus within the audience and within the people who appreciate our art who are not from our communities. They'll see a painting or they'll see a carving and they'll see a totem pole, and they'll see it for the beautiful object that it is and the countless hours that were put in to make those objects. But for us, that's it's more of like a conduit. It's more of like almost like reference material where we can look to that and it will come from a place. It'll come from something that has deep meaning. And that's why I wanted to expand, because we're often seen for our objects. We're seen for our paintings. We're seen for the various totem poles on the coast. I just can't emphasize enough the richness of our culture. For instance, a single painting with two or even just one depiction on there, like say a wolf or a mouse, or maybe it's a painting of someone dancing, could have meaning that you could write a book. In fact, my late relative George Clutesy, his writings often expand upon our ceremonies in a really beautiful way. And a big inspirational piece of writing he did for me was his book titled Potlatch. And it's basically an account of someone attending a potlatch that happened because of a carver carved a canoe. And the single canoe, because in our culture, we will often name things. So this canoe needs to be named, it needs to be brought to life, and we acknowledge it as a living thing within our community and treat it with the respect it deserves. And so this potlatch is to celebrate that. And so during the potlatch, there's many different ceremonies that are shared. and there's many different speeches and poems. He also shares a lot of poetry in that book. And for me, that's the meaning that I find in the art. That's the meaning that I look for, is all of the history and all of the significance of our cultural objects and our ceremonial art. That's stuff that I do when I'm thinking about creating something, or when I'm thinking about practicing art. I think about what piece of our ceremony, what piece of our culture would I like to share in what I'm creating. And I know we only have 20 minutes, so I think I'm going to just kind of close on the conclusion that Nuu-Chah-Nulth art, which is mostly what I create, I also practice Squamish design and art passed down from my teacher, Ray Nachoro. I'd just like to conclude that our art has depth beyond just the beauty and the material objects, but I encourage you to do some research when you're looking at our art and just investigate further. Try to find out where the artist is from, or the history of what's being shown in our art. And you'll find that the art is often just an introduction to you, that you'll be able to find out so much more just from studying in books, or listening to people talk, attending events or cultural ceremonies if you have the opportunity to just see how much you can understand from this introduction. And I'll think, I don't know if that's 20 minutes, but I'm also preparing. I have some pictures of my portfolio I can share if anybody's interested. I can just talk about some pieces that I've done with you, or I'm definitely welcome to answer any questions anybody might have.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was really beautiful, and I really appreciate you sharing about your practice and your past. And yeah, I've been jotting down some notes while you're speaking. We can move on to a Q&A. If there's anyone here who has a question and wants to either unmute yourself and ask it, or you can type it into the chat. And maybe some of the questions will relate to the images of your work, and then so we can kind of show images and have a conversation as well.
Thanks.
Thanks, Josh. I too was jotting down some notes, and you had said that you were going to speak about 4 main points, and I know the juxtaposition of the ceremonial versus the decorative was a very important point to drive home. And then what were some of the other ones that you wanted to make sure, beyond the kind of going deeper when when we're encountering Indigenous work, rather than just staying on the surface?
Oh yeah. So just one of my main points I encourage people when they check out our art is to really look at who created it, because that's really important. I find sometimes people might come across our art or even buy something and they won't know who made it, and that's actually really important for our people. And it's kind of the first thing we look for, because the person who creates it is almost more important than the actual art that they've made, because it's passed down through families, it's passed down through generations. And if you're able to follow their history, or their family that they come from, or their community that they come from, it's just really brings more meaning. Like for instance, if you were to check out my background and, okay, Josh Watts, where is he from? You'll find the Sishat and the Subasat nations. You'll look further, maybe go broader to the Nuu-Chah-Nulth nation that I'm a part of, and you'll find countless pieces of beautiful art. You'll find more artists, and importantly, you'll find our style is very different, because on the Northwest coast, there's not just one art form. It's like almost like everybody has a different dialect and a different style, where that often what we depict in art is really different. And so if you were to look at a Kwakwaka'wakw artist versus a Nuu-Chah-Nulth artist versus a Haida artist versus say a Squamish artist, you'll see that all of our designs look completely different, but similar in a way where we're also a part of a broader group on the Northwest Coast. And so I really encourage people to, if you're studying our art or if you come across any Northwest Coast art, to look at who made the art piece and try and find out where they're from, because you might find many other beautiful pieces of work. And another point I wanted to talk about was just that this is an art that's passed down. It's something that's talked about nowadays is cultural appropriation, where there's also the term misappropriation, or basically like a misuse of our art, or a use of our art without proper knowledge or proper representation, because it's representing our culture, our history, our families, our traditions, that it's a lot more than just the lines that we have on the paper, or you know, the beautiful designs that are on the paper is just an introduction. And so when you're studying art, that's another important thing to think about is this appropriate? Is this being displayed or done by someone in an appropriate way? And I'd like to mention a very well-known artist, the late John Livingston. If you look at my family, we're also the Livingstons. We're not the same family, unrelated. He was a non-Indigenous artist who lived on the coast for a very long time, but he actually grew up and was married into, I believe, the Numgis band, the Numgis Nation, which is a Kwakwaka'wakw group in centrally located in Alert Bay. But he married a woman who was Kwakwaka'wakw, and he practiced our art form for a larger part of his life. But all the way until he passed, he had taught many artists that were Indigenous on the coast from what he had learned. I don't know for sure, don't quote me on this, but I think he learned from a generation of say Doug Cramer, like the generation above him, was who he learned from. And he worked with artists that were very welcome to him. And it's because of his entire life was around our art. His income, his wife worked in the potlatching community, helping different people with their regalia, and his whole career he spent teaching younger artists how to do and how to create art in a respectful way. And he also worked with a group of other artists who worked and did similar things. And so that's something I wanted to mention, because appropriation gets talked about these days, and I feel like there's for some people there's some gray area, but for us it's actually very clear and it's very straightforward. And that's if you're doing our art, it's the intention behind why you're doing it is what makes it appropriate or not. And so for John, he truly loved our art, respected our art, and as an artist, we all have a responsibility to our communities. This isn't something I could just do because I enjoy it and have fun doing it. And if I'm the only one profiting off of it, our community sees that as just taking. It's just taking our art and using it for your own profit, which isn't very respectful to all of the elders and all of the survivors in our communities that fought very hard for us to be able to practice this. And my final note on that is that people lost their lives in history for us to be able to practice this art. And so when people aren't coming from that background or are doing our art, people will see it as taking from us, or just straight up stealing or exploiting us for their own personal gain. And so that's why so many people in our communities are very vocal and speak out against appropriating our art. Myself personally, I think I don't teach anybody who's from elsewhere. And there, for a long time, when I was learning, there were people talking about, is it appropriate for women to learn? And we're far beyond this now. My personal belief is that everyone who's come to help me, most of them have identified as women or have been women. There's also some people who were not, they were gender neutral, and they were trans. And I find that it's really important to see people's intention while they're learning art. I don't really think in our day and age it's appropriate to limit people based on their gender or their sexual orientation. So I'm open to teaching people if they're willing to learn, but also if they have that ancestral background and they have the teachings that I grew up with, or they grew up in a community and are highly respected and supported by the community to be able to do this. And so that was another point. Thanks for bringing it up, Kagan. I'm glad you asked that, because I did want to talk about that, and I think it does suit the subject very well, because it's terms and topics that are talked about on our coast here, and I like to give some input on it because I know it's such a buzzword talking about certain things. So yeah, thanks.
Oh, that was really great, Josh. And I love all the places you took that answer. I see Olivier has his hand raised for a question.
Thank you so much. Before the question, I would like to thank again Creative Mornings Victoria for making this online, because as you see, I'm from Belgium and I'm really blessed to attend this online and to hear from you. And thanks for bringing this topic about culture. And I will just add that in my youth, I had the chance to read a book that quite transformed my life, To Spoil the Sun. I really recommend, from Joyce Rockwood. It's a book about the 15th century, written as if the narrator was Amerindian. So to come to my question, I'm really curious to know if you had the chance to hear stories from your parents, your grandparents, or elders about your culture. And also a sub-question, are there resources online or some books where it's from the culture, your culture perspective? Because I know that the story is not the same depending on the side of the government and on the side of the cultures. And I would like to hear more from the culture part rather than do to the government, because I feel like the story from the government are quite biased from their point of view and not from at the advantage of the people that you represent, and that I'm really happy to know more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that question, Olivier. That's a good perspective, and I'm glad you asked that, because a lot of the times our culture and our stories that were recorded were from people who were called like academics when they were like studying us. They were writing it from their perspective, and that's something that's also being addressed nowadays within our communities, is being able to learn from what they shared, but also realize that a lot of it's coming from their paraphrasing or coming from their adapting translations or directly erasing things they didn't agree with or changing things. Me personally, so a bit more on my upbringing is that when I was young, so my dad, he went to residential school, and unfortunately I didn't really get to have him in my life, and that's because of his suffering, that I wasn't actually able to grow up with him. And so we moved away. My brother, myself, and my mom grew up I grew up in Squamish. And briefly, when I was talking about my upbringing, I didn't know about nations. I thought we were all part of one nation. And as I grew up, I started to understand, like, I'm not from Squamish. I'm not from here. And so my first time going back to Port Alberni that I can remember is the first time I met my auntie and my niece and my first cousin. In our culture, our first cousins are seen as siblings, because a few generations ago, all of the kids would be raised mostly by the grandparents. And so your parents, your uncle and auntie is seen as your parents' first cousins are also your uncle and auntie. And so their kids, if your father or mother had siblings, their kids were your siblings as well, because you'd often be raised together. So I unfortunately didn't grow up with all of them. I grew up away and in Squamish. However, because of my fortunate time canoe racing, I was able to meet a lot of great Squamish people, and even my canoe skipper, his name is Slamish Jim. He's from Cowichan. I believe I know he's from a few nations in the Cowichan tribes. He's from sorry, I'm blanking. I know he's from the Cowichan area. I know he's Cowichan, but I can't exactly remember which specific nation he's from. But anyways, he shared a lot of stories from his nation with us growing up. So I had the privilege of learning from him and learning from his wife, Aggie. Her traditional name is Sisaquelia. She's Squamish. So I grew up around people, and I just sort of gravitated towards my indigenous. I'm not related to them, but they treated me like family. They treated me like I was a part of the nation. And in fact, later in life, I was adopted by them culturally. And so I often think about my upbringing, learning their stories. It's kind of interesting. For instance, all along the coast, we have a common story theme of there was a great flood on the coast thousands of years ago. And so we all share a flood story. And when you're looking around our landscape, you'll see that there's many sort of really tall mountain peaks. And you'll find mostly on the coast that the tallest mountain is usually where each nation tied their canoe to during the flood. And the Squamish people, my people in Port Alberni, the Sishot people, we all have a flood story. And so it was interesting hearing the Squamish stories in Squamish, hearing their origin stories, hearing how they got their gifts and how they got some of their ceremonies, and being able to now, as an adult, go back to my ancestral territory in Port Alberni and Sishot, Hahuthli in our territory, and learn our stories. For instance, there's this story about the flood that our people experienced and survived through, where our canoes were drifting apart. And a long time ago, we weren't sure if we were going to be able to stay in our territory when the flood would later subside. And so a woman named Chith Kachit, she called on the Creator, and she was sacrificing herself so that everybody could survive. And so she was transformed into a mountain. And the mountain now is called Aerosmith. For whatever reason, they call it Mount Aerosmith, but we see that as a remembrance of her sacrifice and of our history of the flood. And so we tied our canoes, and when the flood receded, we were able to still be in our territory. And so that kind of roughly summarizes like my growing up and how I've been able to now as an adult learn my nation stories, but also growing up with a lot of Squamish stories that I learned from my teachers and elders. As for the second part of your question about where or what resources are available, I highly recommend, when you're looking at books or any kind of writing from anthropologists, to look at their sources, because if they don't list any of our people's names, for instance, if you were to study Franz Boas's work, I believe he was a German anthropologist who came over here and lived in modern day Alert Bay for a long time. he actually got everything he knew and everything he ever wrote. He learned from a man. I have his manuscripts. I think it's George Hunt. What? Sorry. I don't know if you can still hear me, but I have my headphones connected. There are different. Sorry. Oh no, it's over here. So there are books when you're looking at like books such as this. This is called the manuscripts of George Hunt. George Hunt is the indigenous person where Franz Boas got a lot of his content from. And so if you're reading a book by Franz Boas, as you were saying, there's a lot of different bias, but also he interpreted things from a German perspective. And even though he immersed himself in our culture for a very long time, George Hunt's actual work is what we now look to, because Franz Boas, he often misunderstood things, sometimes entirely. And so when you're looking for books by anthropologists, I would recommend looking at their sources. Another good book and another good way to research. Can you still hear me when I'm walking far away from my phone? You can? Oh, okay. So another good book and another good thing to look at if you're interested in studying our history and studying our art is to look for books that were actually written by our people. So this is the book I mentioned earlier. This is the book by George Clutesy, titled Potlatch. And this is late George. So he did all of the art, and he actually wrote this book, and he has a couple others he wrote. But if you find books that are actually written by Indigenous people, often in the introduction section or in the mention of the author, we'll talk about where they're from. And what I've done when I'm researching books, I'll look at the publisher as well. So if you find, say, George Clutesy's book was published by Gray's Publishing, located in Sydney, British Columbia, if you look at their books that have been published, sometimes you'll find other authors, because it's not really talked about, but we weren't actually allowed to do a lot of things for a long time. It was illegal for us to practice our culture, and it was illegal for us to talk about our culture. And George actually spent a long time advocating for us to be able to practice our culture and teach our culture. And it wasn't for, I can't remember exactly how long the potlatch ban was for, but for that very long time in history, you will find a big gap that's all written by anthropologists during that time. And I recommend, if you are looking at stuff to study, the recent stuff is actually really good. The recent books, I have one here that was published in partnership with the museum, I believe. It's good to always look at who participated in writing the book. So this is a great book if you're interested in Nuu-Chah-Nulth culture. I can't recommend it enough. It's called, is this mirrored for you? Sorry. It's called Nuu-Chah-Nulth: Voices, Histories, Objects, and Journeys. And this was a piece that was a collection of countless people who were Nuu-Chah-Nulth, and it's actually written by our people, and it was edited by Alan Hoover. So if you find like editors like, sorry, I don't know if you can see the spelling, but Alan Hoover, if you find certain editors or anthropologists, if you study their work, so if you're going to study Nuu-Chah-Nulth culture, usually an anthropologist would specialize in like one cultural group. So for Franz Boas, almost all of his writings, like that he's really gone in deep with talking about and writing about, is Kwakwaka'wakw. So if you look up Franz Boas, you'll find mostly Kwakwaka'wakw. He also covered different nations as well, but from my studying, it's mostly Kwakwaka'wakw. But this book was published in pretty recent times. It was in 2000, so 22 years ago, and it was copyrighted and published by the Royal BC Museum. Sorry. Anyways, yeah, this book, if you are interested in our culture, it's a great introduction. There are many other books that this book references. And so I also recommend when you are studying our book, it's actually a really academic process, and it's kind of weird because it's really inaccessible to our people because we're very literate, we're very educated in our communities, but we grew up with oral traditions, and so book reading and writing is not really our cultural practice. And so everything that we learn, I learn, is mostly from books and secondhand knowledge from when I'm studying art. But if you ever have the opportunities for learning from someone directly, that's always the best way. And then asking them, where did they hear that story from? Where did they read that in? Or asking them like where and who and how and when is really important. And if you do not have the privilege of learning from someone firsthand, reading firsthand, like direct quoted knowledge in books is the next best thing. And so a lot of these books will just take conversations or dialogues with our people, and they will just transcribe it into a book. And so a lot of this information is just directly from a conversation with one of our elders. And so those are the best books to study from if you want to hear like a genuine sort of overall opinion or overall perspective on our culture and background on our culture. I'll give you kind of a bad example. There's lots of knowledge in there, but it's not really, I wouldn't recommend it if you were studying it. And it's because it's almost comical now, because the stuff that's said in this book is like, it's kind of seen now as even the title. So this is called the Nuu-Chah. Nuu-Chah is a part of a word called the word is Nuu-Chah-Nulth, and it's means to go around the bend, means to keep going around the bend. And that was the first word that Captain Cook heard when he was coming to Friendly Cove. We were yelling Nuu-Chah-Nulth, like go around the bend. And some people say it's because they were telling him to get out of here and not to come in here. But there's also some occurrence where people were saying to keep going around the bend. There's better harbor there. There's a better bay. And so that was what our people were called for the longest time. And we didn't identify with Nuu-Chah because that's just a part of a word. Like it's not even a complete word, and has nothing to do with our people's identity. And so now we call ourselves the Nuu-Chah-Nulth. I believe it means it's a description of the territory we live on, which is the west coast of Vancouver Island. It's along these cascading mountains, and it stretches all the way down to the coasts and to the waters. And from beyond, you'll see like the horizon, and that's all you can see is because we're the most westernmost landmass on our area. And so this is actually, there's good knowledge in this book, the Nuu-Chah, Scenes and Studies of Savage Life. And so it's clearly, even the title, you can hear the writer's perspective. And it's written by Gilbert Malcolm Sprout, the namesake of a lake called Sprout Lake. And so some of his writing is like kind of ridiculous because it's almost entirely like his perspective, and the way he talks about our people is like pretty ridiculous. And when I'm reading it, it's all from his, he's extracted knowledge from our elders and from our people to learn what he knows. And then he's created his own like narrative and his own like dialogue that he creates in here to try and communicate what our life is like, the scenes and studies of savage life to white people from where he's from. And so I picked this up and I've been reading it because it's actually really interesting to compare and contrast how he writes versus, say, George Clouthier, who writes in a way that's like really respectful, really well spoken, and obviously very like poetic and very artistic in the way that he's written his book. And I really love his writing. And so reading his book and the way he talks about our people is very respectful and very loving, and just really beautiful scenes. And then reading Gilbert Malcolm Sprout's, his study and his knowledge is like black and white. Like he starts talking about really weird things, and he like emphasizes things that were entirely of his own imagination. He'll talk about for like a whole chapter. And you'll see what their priorities are when they're writing these books. It's often romanticizing our people to his audience to like sell his books. And he's an academic. Like there are things you can learn from reading different anthropologists' writings, but always look for their sources and see if they've actually written something. Always look for like, where did they get their information from? Because none of it's through observation entirely. A lot of it's from conversations and probably living with the person that they're learning from. And so, yeah, just when you're finding books, if you look up a specific nation, so that would be if you're trying to find where to start, like where do I start when I'm looking for resources to learn about our culture, find what area you'd like to learn about. So if you're learning about my people, the Nuu-Chah-Nulth people, we're located on the west coast of Vancouver Island. If you search up Nuu-Chah-Nulth culture or Nuu-Chah-Nulth books or Nuu-Chah-Nulth research, you'll probably find the one I mentioned, Nuu-Chah-Nulth Voices, Histories, Objects, and Journeys, because this work took a very long time. It's actually, I believe it was a piece accompanied by an exhibition, and there's another book titled Out of the Mist. Those books will probably come up first because they're really recent and they have really great writing in them. But if you're trying to look for specific like stories, just make sure you research that the person recollecting the stories is actually from our area, or else it might be either entirely untrue or just really butchered. Yeah, but I'd recommend, that's how I'd recommend if you want to learn and you're not able to like go to our community and learn or attend events and ceremonies. If you're looking for books, that's what I would recommend.
Thanks, Josh. So we've got about 5 more minutes left in our hour together. Are there any other questions from our collective here? You know, as we reflect on today and then the much larger problem of 500 years of colonization, I'm reminded of something that I published earlier this year talking about decolonizing it within institutions and how there's this metaphor, and you know, I say this with knowing that metaphors are also violence, but there's this metaphor around the parallax, which, you know, when you're driving fast and you see trees zoom by, but then every once in a while, you know, they look very clear. And I think for me and a lot of people working within institutions, it seems like everything is happening so fast. But at the same time, if you're from a community that has been historically marginalized and overlooked or you know, actively suppressed, it can't happen fast enough. It's so glacially slow. So I think these are the kind of topics that we're constantly grappling with. And I really appreciate, Josh, what you said earlier today about making space for anyone that wants to be actively engaged in the conversation, whether, you know, using your hands or using your mind. And no matter who you are, there's room. So I think that was a really important takeaway for us from today. In particular, when we think about traditions and traditional activities and how they have been at times exclusionary to even people within the tribe based on their gender or their orientation or whatever. So I think a really clear path forward together is just making space for whoever wants to be there as long as there's the open heart and you know, the good way forward. So okay, anything else before we wrap up? Just my rambling.
Yeah, I think that was a great morning talk. But
yeah, it's not even noon.
yeah, I just wanted to welcome anybody if they're interested in chatting or if they ever want to learn more. Please reach out. I have my email, my website, but I also have social media at the Joshua Watts. If you ever want to just check out what I do, or if you want to chat or talk about culture, even if you have any other like relevant questions on like where do I find more about your people, or often I'll get asked from my own people like, hey, where did you learn this? And I'll share where I learned it from. And so I'm always down to talk about art and culture. And yeah, just thanks for inviting me to share a little bit about my people and what I do.
That's great. And I'll just remind everyone that Gifts from the Ancestors, along with the welcome song by Linnea Jericho, are still on at the Victoria Arts Council at 1800 Store Street until October 30th. So please, if you haven't already done so, check it out. You can read Kate Chino's artopenings.ca review of Josh's project. And the next Creative Morning is with Linnea, and that's going to be October 28th, I believe. Is that right? The last Friday in October, whatever that date is. So yeah, we heard from Josh today, obviously, and next month we'll hear from Linnea, and that'll be fantastic. So thank you,
Write
everyone.
it down, mark it in your calendar. It's going to be a good one.
Great.
Thank you
Josh.
so much.
Right on. Thanks, everybody.
Have a great weekend.
Thanks.
Thank you. Take
Happy
care.
weekend. Thank you so much for organizing this. Really, you are transforming lives.
Thank you, Olivier. Okay, take care, everyone.